Well, good morning, Brentwood family. It's nice to be sending you a message this morning and a message from the Gospel of Luke. And I wanted to start out just by kind of giving us a little bit of a framework for the next section of Luke and a little bit of background into the thought process that went into this study this morning. So first of all, I'll show a little bit of some resources that I used. Number one, I used the Kingdom New Testament translation. This is a translation that N.T. Wright has, I guess, self-translated. And I really like the way that it reads, really fresh and invigorating. And you read it, and then you compare it alongside something like the New American Standard, and you're like, did it really say that? And then you read the New American Standard, and you say, oh, it did say that, just with a little bit of different vocabulary. Definitely some British vocabulary, but different things stand out. And I really recommend this translation. And in that same vein, I also used the Luke for Everyone in N.T. Wright. I really like N.T. Wright. His commentary for everyone. And I really like the phraseology just of this concept is that this commentary is accessible, and in reading it, it helps kind of give a larger framework for what the writers of different books are doing. And it doesn't always nail down every specific story or every specific detail, but kind of sets them up in a nice framework for you to work through. So in this section, when I agreed to go through this section with you, I was said this is the chapters are essentially Luke chapter 10 through chapter 20, and so I need to cover about 2 chapters each week, and so I'm kind of starting to process, like, where do I even begin with this? And I want to talk through so much of my process because, number one, as a teacher, I think the process of something is really, really important. Oftentimes when I'm working with my students, they want to know, how do I get this specific grade? And, well, what does the end project look like? What am I supposed to do? And the end product and the end result of an assignment, of course, that's important. But so often the real heart of conversation and the real heart of growth happens in that process. What mistakes did you make along the way? How can you learn from that mistake? What were you proud of along the way? So working through just the process of anything, I think can give insight into, a thought process, and not emphasize the end final destination, because as we'll see in this section, it is all about the journey. And so when I looked at this section, it was actually labeled Toward Jerusalem. And so, of course, that makes my brain think of journeying. And so I did a little bit of thinking about journeying as I was preparing for this. But really, the first step for me when I was thinking about preparing for this was I read through the sections multiple times. So chapters 10 through 20, multiple readings, just kind of listening and looking for what stood out to me. And I kept little notes in my phone as I was reading. So if something struck my heart or my ear, I would jot it down. And then, of course, I would connect things that are going on in my life, like being a parent, and I read something and I say, oh, maybe I can connect this to what Reagan and I are talking about with the girls. Or I'm a teacher. How does that lens affect the way that I read this? Or I'm a man. How does this affect the way that I read this? So just reading through those things, looking for themes, looking for different things that stand out. And one of the things that stood out to me in this section was specifically just the number of times that the word Jerusalem is mentioned. And so then I started reading it with that lens and looking back through and Google searching, well, how many times was the word Jerusalem used in Luke? And you could probably do a quick Google search, or if you pause the video, you could read through chunks of this text And you would probably notice that Jerusalem is repeated, specifically mentioned several times. And by several, I mean 30. Like, I think it was 30 something. And I thought, well, is that a lot? And so I compared it to the other Gospels, and it was around 13, 12, 14 in the other Gospels. So I was kind of, paid attention to that because it was almost double. So then I started thinking kind of like, well, what if I treated Jerusalem almost like another character in this section? It's mentioned so many times. What's happening to Jerusalem? What is the purpose of Jerusalem being mentioned so many times? And so I want to do a little exercise, and it'll take either some fast fingers or some listening ears. That's like a 5th grade language, so sorry about that. Listening ears, everyone. It'll take some quick fingers flipping through text, or you can just listen, or you can pause the video. But I want you to listen to not every single time the word Jerusalem is used, but many of them. And then just looking with that lens, we're going to dig into this text a little bit more. So starting in chapter 2, verse number 22. And I'm not going to read these verbatim, but I'm going to paraphrase them for you. So you can look back at these specifically, or you can flip to them quickly. We'll be in Luke, and we're going to be going chronologically through, so you can probably flip along through these. So in chapter 2 alone, there was at least 4 mentions of Jerusalem. Number 1 verse is chapter 2, verse 22, where Jesus is brought to Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. And then verse 25, Simeon is in Jerusalem, waiting for the consolation of Israel. Then in verse 38, Anna is speaking to those who are waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. And then in verse 45, he returned to look for Jesus in Jerusalem. And in verse 49, he doesn't say Jerusalem, but Jesus says, where would I be but in my Father's house? And so just even at the onset of this book, Jerusalem's being mentioned repeatedly, and it's a place of course, great value and of the centrality of the message and the people of Israel. And Jesus is entering into the world and the stage with Jerusalem being a centerpiece for the presence of God in his people. And then if we kind of keep going, chapter 4, the tempter brought Jesus to Jerusalem, and he set him up on the pinnacle of the temple. He said, call the angels to guard you. And this will be brought up again, why he doesn't call legions of angels later when he is brought up and lifted up. In chapter 5, verse 17, teachers of the law actually had come from all parts of Jerusalem. So people are being drawn out of Jerusalem to see and meet with Jesus. In chapter 6, verse 17, the same concept is mentioned when multitudes have come from Judea and Jerusalem. And then that gets us creeping up a little bit closer to actually our section that we're going to be focusing on for the next 5 weeks. And that is chapter 9, verse 31. It talks about when he was about to accomplish and fulfill all of the things at Jerusalem. And then in 9:51, he set his face to Jerusalem. And in 9:53, his face was set toward Jerusalem. And I actually want to pause here because then I'm going to keep going, but I'll let you kind of catch your breath with the Jerusalem thing. But throughout this study, as I was kind of noticing this, and really Reagan and I were discussing this and talking through all of these concepts, and she was a wonderful conversation partner and a leader in kind of thinking through a lot of these thoughts and organizing a lot of these thoughts together. And I really just appreciate her so much for doing that and guiding me and teaching me along the way. And so as we were kind of, especially her, I love her literary mind. And so she was able to kind of help think about Jerusalem as this character and as what is its flow throughout the Gospel of Luke. So really, really a helpful way to look at things. So now let me keep going. And I know that this is a lot of big picture stuff, but for me, framing things in a big picture way helps me actually pin down specifics as I'm going through a text. So in chapter 10, kind of continuing on, we've got actually the first parable. And this is the men are traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. And so it's interesting that the first parable that Jesus tells on this journey is a parable about people journeying. And then chapter 13, they're teaching and journeying towards Jerusalem. Again, it's just mentioned. In chapter 13:33, I must go on my way today. A prophet cannot perish away from Jerusalem. And then skipping ahead a little bit to chapter 17, it says, on the way to Jerusalem, passing between Samaria and Galilee. So the journey continues. Chapter 18, verse 31, see, we're going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the Son of Man will be accomplished. Then in chapter 19, he told the parable, and this is verse 11, he told the parable because they were near Jerusalem. Chapter 19, verse 28, and when he had said these things, he went up on ahead to Jerusalem. And that's actually the end of our section that we'll cover in the next 5 weeks, chapter about 9 through 19 to 20 or so. But it continues on as it ends out the book of Luke. In chapter 21, Jerusalem is surrounded. In chapter 21, verse 24, Jerusalem is about to be trampled underfoot. In chapter 23, verse 7, sent to Herod, who was in Jerusalem. So Jesus is now sent to Jerusalem to meet with Herod. And chapter 23, verse 28 talks about the daughters of Jerusalem and not weeping for them. The hardships are coming. And then chapter 24, in Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem, again giving us that location. Chapter 24, verse 18, talking to Jesus after the resurrection, says, "Are you?" And these are the men and the group that are traveling, and they say to Jesus, "Are you the only one who doesn't know of the things that have happened in Jerusalem?" So what an ironic question for them to ask, as if there's a magnet, right? That's just from Jesus's birth to the end of his life. It's almost just pulling him and vortexing him to this end in Jerusalem and this new beginning in Jerusalem. In chapter 24, verse 33, the 11 returned to Jerusalem, saying, "The Lord has risen." In chapter 24, verse 47, the gospel should be proclaimed to all nations, beginning in Jerusalem. And in chapter 24, verse 52, they returned to Jerusalem with great joy, continually blessing God. And now this would be the beginning and an end, and a new beginning for the followers of Jesus. And the new beginning begins and ends in Jerusalem. And I'm not going to continue, I promise, into the book of Acts, but the writer, Luke, this is really written as a 2-part series. And so this concept of journeying is going to continue in the book of Acts. Think about the missionary journeys that are recorded there. So this concept of journeying is all throughout this book of Luke, and especially in the section chapters 9 through chapters 20. So let's zoom in just a little bit into this section, and I want to specifically kind of think about the ways that this is playing at like the importance of Jerusalem, and obviously it's completely central to what is going on in the life of Israel. But also at the same time, this section, we're going to zoom in on chapters 10 through 11. It has kind of 4 movements that we saw when Reagan and I were discussing it. Number 1, that yes, Jerusalem is central, and yes, Israel is central, but this is about to be, the message is about to be expanded to Gentiles. And in chapter 10, we'll look at a little bit of a story that expands to Gentiles. And also in chapter 10, there is an expansion to Samaritans, the hated rival or the hated foreign group to the Jews. And then again at the very end of chapter 10, there's the story of Mary and Martha. And there's this expansion to women in this gospel and in this movement. And then finally, again, it kind of echoes again in chapter 11, expanding back to Gentiles. So we thought it was a very interesting way of thinking about how central Jerusalem is to this message and to the message of Jesus, but also, as is mentioned in the final chapter of Luke, the gospel should be proclaimed to all nations, beginning in Jerusalem, but it's bigger than Jerusalem. And so Reagan and I joked that this section was called To Jerusalem and Beyond. And if you don't know the play of that, then maybe whatever. It's fine. It's like the Toy Story, To Infinity and Beyond. But all that to being said, so that's a little bit of the thought process, the workings that went behind it. And really it was reading, Google searching, and talking and communicating and working through those things. And it's really just makes me just appreciate this section of Luke that I hadn't really thought about so much before, but it is really, really unique. And I really love the way that Luke has in mind kind of the Exodus story during this section. He keys on the idea of, when the Jews didn't travel much, but when they did, they traveled to Jerusalem. Their one trip a year, the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And often when they did that, they would tell the Exodus story. And the Exodus story, and other biblical stories as well. But surely Luke has this backdrop in mind. If you look back at chapter 9, verse 31, Jesus is being transfigured there, and he mentions Moses and Elijah and talking about the departure from this world, or the exodus from this world, and the exodus that will be fulfilled in Jerusalem. And so that Exodus language is kind of scattered throughout this section. And so I encourage you, as you're reading this section, look for that language, because it's really rich and full. The other thing was that, in the very first part of this section, in chapter 10, he sends out 70 messengers, or some translations say 72 messengers. And those messengers, that word is often in the Old Testament as angels or messengers. In Exodus 23, he does this very same thing, sending out messengers before this great journey is going to happen. So just some of those little echoes from Exodus I think are really, really interesting. Now, I'm looking at my time because I just didn't know how long this would go. But so I'm already at 18 minutes just in my framework introduction. And, so a good another 40 minutes and we'll be done. And of course, all teachers love to make that joke where the time is going long and it'll be only longer before we're done. But that's actually the joke of the journey, right? The whole, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Or are we there yet? And I just want to just kind of leave us, before we go into these 4 examples, leave us with that idea of this journey, this process is so important. Wherever you have begun your journey, the commitment to stay on that journey, the commitment to learn and grow in that journey, the commitment to, when you fall down, be around people that can lift you up and move you forward. When you see people fall down on the journey, be someone that can be a neighbor. In this section is the Good Samaritan. Of course, we think about what it is to be a good neighbor. But let's make sure we cover a couple of these things about expanding this, because it's not just about Jerusalem, but it is also this idea of expanding. So in the first 12 verses of chapter 10, this is that sending out. They're being sent out, and this is that idea of going out to the Gentiles. And they are asked to send out in peace. And I was trying to look at my notes back here because I'm scrolling on my phone. And it says in verse 5, bring peace. In verse 9, heal the sick. And we want to be as gentle as lambs. In verse 4, you have trust and faith. In verse 5, again, it's that openness to bear a message of peace. In verse 11, don't be discouraged as you're sent out to expand to Gentiles. And then let's jump over to verse 25. And this is the story of the Good Samaritan. And so, of course, you could pause and you could read the story of the Good Samaritan. But one thing that I thought was interesting in thinking about this section was, of course, we're expanding this view that Samaritans can be vessels of good and vessels of God. And the people that you think should stop and help actually don't. And I read in the N.T. Wright commentary, he mentioned that the priest and the Levite, I was trying to think of the other name, the priest and the Levite, they were actually preserving their purity by kind of avoiding touching what could have been a corpse. So in their striving to follow and remain pure and follow this religious practice, they actually were not a neighbor. And so that pushes me a little bit in my thinking of where is the following the tradition or following a purity call, but I'm actually missing the what it means to actually be a neighbor. And so Jesus' answer is that there is a wider and truer fulfillment of the question that the lawyer asks, like, who is my neighbor? Well, that's the question that the lawyer asked. And Jesus' answer is actually far wider and far more grace-filled than the answer that the lawyer was expecting. Because there was a true Jewish answer about who your neighbor was. And Jesus didn't quite answer the question in the way that the lawyer expected it. And then maybe my favorite section that I was looking at when I was studying this was chapter 10, verse 38 through 42. And Reagan was telling me that there's a common book that people have used to talk about this juxtaposition of Mary and Martha, and it's called Being a Mary in a Martha World. So the way that this story, I think, has often been presented, and this is, of course, according to Reagan telling me, is that it's often, you might desire to be at the feet of Jesus and be learning, and yet there's the pulls of the pulls of work and the pulls of your duties in the home and those kinds of things that are balancing, that are preventing you from choosing what Jesus calls as the better part. And so the encouragement from the book is try to choose the better part and push those tasks that need to be done, or the service tasks, make sure you have a balance of both of those things. But I think that actually misses the real thrust of the radical power of this passage. And it's that Mary was actually stepping into a man's space in that world. And so anthropologists suggest and say that there were different spaces for men and women, especially during that time period. But I think we can even think about our recent history and even now how there's spoken or unspoken spaces for men and spaces for women. And in this moment, Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus, entering into the space where men usually sit and usually are located. And the same language is used to refer to Saul in Acts when he's said to be sitting at the feet of Gamaliel. And what they would be doing is not just gushing over their rabbi or like, oh, I adore you so much, as maybe we think, Mary just loved Jesus so much. She just couldn't help herself. She had to be near Jesus. And that may be true, but she was putting herself in the position to learn and to be educated and to be taught and instructed by a rabbi. And Jesus says, you have chosen the better part. And so what a radical story and a radical teaching about the power and inclusivity that this gospel and this kingdom and this journey is going to include along the way. And then the last thing that I'll leave you with, actually, look, this was my notes. Right? And then I was going to say the last thing I would leave you with, but I don't have actually any more notes. So there is so much more. That was just jumping into chapter 10. But I want you to maybe read the next chapter with that in mind of where is Jesus then expanding this message to not just centralized to Jerusalem or centralized to Israelites, but there's praise of Jonah, the sign of Jonah in chapter 11, where the Ninevites, they repent, that story. So that's not the people that should repent. There's the Queen of Sheba, who's praised for her wisdom. And then the people that you might think that this should be centralized around, the Pharisees, at the end of the chapter, there is woes to the Pharisees. So this journey that Jesus is embarking onto Jerusalem is by no means the journey that everybody around him expected it to be. And he is very actively, very intentionally showing the kind of kingdom and the kind of fulfillment that is going to happen in Jerusalem. So as you journey this week, may you be encouraged to look for a widening path of how you can be a servant to everyone, to be a neighbor to people around you, to sit at the feet of Jesus, and to maybe put yourself in a position where maybe we are like the Pharisees sometimes, and we need to hear a correction of woe to me, and there's an urging for me. So grace and peace, and I look forward to the day that we can all be together more regularly and more consistently. Grace and peace to you. Farewell.